In August 1914, Germany activated what military historians consider the most meticulously planned offensive in human history. The Schlieffen Plan was supposed to be Germany's masterpiece, a mathematical solution to an impossible problem that would win World War I in exactly 42 days. And for the first 4 weeks, it worked with terrifying precision, as over 1.5 million German soldiers flooded across the Belgian border in the largest military movement the world had ever witnessed, smashing through fortresses that Belgian engineers swore could hold out for months, burning ancient cities like Leuven with its irreplaceable medieval library, creating waves of refugees that shocked global opinion, and racing toward Paris so fast that French commanders literally couldn't believe the intelligence reports, because no army in history had ever moved with such speed and coordination across such vast distances. The architect of this plan, an elderly Prussian general named Alfred von Schlieffen, had spent the final years of his career obsessed with solving Germany's strategic nightmare. Trapped in the heart of Europe, between France, who burned for revenge after their humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and Russia, whose massive but slow-moving army was modernizing and growing stronger every year, and Schlieffen knew with absolute certainty that if Germany ever had to fight both powers simultaneously in a two-front war, the nation would be crushed between these giants like a walnut in a vice, stretched too thin, unable to concentrate forces, bleeding resources until inevitable collapse. So Schlieffen devoted nearly a decade to creating what he believed was the perfect solution, running endless war games, studying every historical campaign from Hannibal's victory at Cannae to Napoleon's disasters in Russia, analyzing railroad timetables down to the minute, calculating march speeds down to the kilometer, measuring the carrying capacity of every road and bridge in Belgium and northern France, until he had constructed a plan so precise it read more like a train schedule than a military operation. The moment war was declared, Germany would ignore France's heavily fortified eastern border, where the French expected the attack, and instead commit 7/8 of the entire German army to a massive sweeping movement through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, curving down through northern France like a giant scythe, enveloping Paris from the west, trapping the French armies against their own fortifications, and forcing complete surrender within exactly 42 days, after which the entire German army would use Germany's superior railroad network to rapidly redeploy eastward and smash into Russian forces who Schlieffen calculated would take at least 6 weeks to fully mobilize, due to Russia's primitive infrastructure and vast distances. The plan required split-second timing, absolute commitment to the offensive, and the willingness to violate Belgian neutrality, which had been guaranteed by international treaty since 1839. Germany would ignore France's heavily fortified eastern border, where the French expected the attack, and instead commit 7/8 of the entire German army to a massive sweeping movement through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, curving down through northern France like a giant scythe, enveloping Paris from the west, trapping the French armies against their own fortifications, and forcing complete surrender within exactly 42 days, after which the entire German army would use Germany's superior railroad network to rapidly redeploy eastward and smash into Russian forces who Schlieffen calculated would take at least 6 weeks to fully mobilize, due to Russia's primitive infrastructure and vast distances. The plan required split-second timing, absolute commitment to the offensive, and the willingness to violate Belgian neutrality, which had been guaranteed by international treaty since 1839. But Schlieffen dismissed moral objections with cold Prussian pragmatism, allegedly whispering on his deathbed in 1913, "Keep the right wing strong," referring to the crucial northern attacking force that would sweep through Belgium. And for nearly a decade after his retirement, this plan sat in German military archives like a coiled spring under tremendous pressure, while an entire generation of German officers studied it, refined it, built their whole military doctrine around it, constructing new railways to facilitate troop movements, positioning ammunition depots, planning supply routes, until the Schlieffen Plan wasn't just one strategy among many, it was Germany's only strategy, the singular answer to every potential conflict scenario. And when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by a teenage Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, setting off a diplomatic crisis that spiraled out of control. Control with terrifying speed as the alliance system activated like a chain of explosives. Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, Russia mobilizing to defend Serbia, Germany declaring war on Russia, and then France, Britain entering to protect Belgian neutrality. The German military had only one response programmed into its institutional memory, and that was to activate the Schlieffen Plan with mechanical precision. On August 4, 1914, over 1 million German soldiers in field gray uniforms and distinctive spiked helmets began crossing into Belgium, demanding free passage, which Belgian King Albert I refused with unexpected defiance, declaring that Belgium would resist even against impossible odds. And what followed shocked the world, as the German army, desperate to maintain its rigid timetable, smashed through Belgian defenses with overwhelming force, and responded to civilian resistance with calculated brutality, burning entire towns, executing civilians in mass reprisals, destroying Leuven's ancient library with its priceless medieval manuscripts, creating newspaper headlines across Europe and America. German atrocities and the rape of Belgium that would turn global public opinion decisively against Germany and eventually help bring the United States into the war. The German advance won control with terrifying speed, as the alliance system activated like a chain of explosives. Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, Russia mobilizing to defend Serbia, Germany declaring war on Russia, and then France, Britain entering to protect Belgian neutrality. The German military had only one response programmed into its institutional memory, and that was to activate the Schlieffen Plan with mechanical precision. On August 4, 1914, over 1 million German soldiers in field gray uniforms and distinctive spiked helmets began crossing into Belgium, demanding free passage, which Belgian King Albert I refused with unexpected defiance, declaring that Belgium would resist even against impossible odds. And what followed shocked the world. Desperate to maintain its rigid timetable, smashed through Belgian defenses with overwhelming force, and responded to civilian resistance with calculated brutality, burning entire towns, executing civilians in mass reprisals, destroying Leuven's ancient library with its priceless medieval manuscripts, creating newspaper headlines across Europe and America, about as staggering in its scale and speed. Endless columns of soldiers in field gray uniforms, marching in perfect formation, stretching to the horizon, horse-drawn artillery batteries miles long, supply wagons and ammunition trains following behind, all moving with such coordination that French generals initially refused to believe it, couldn't comprehend that Germany had committed so much of its army to this single massive wheeling movement. And the fortress city of Liège, which Belgian military planners believed could hold out for months, fell in just days to specialized German siege artillery, including the monstrous 42-centimeter Big Bertha howitzers that fired shells weighing nearly a ton and could demolish the most modern concrete fortifications like they were made of cardboard. And Brussels fell on August 20th as the Belgian army retreated westward, and German forces continued their inexorable push deeper into France. Meanwhile, French commanders who had developed their own war plan called Plan 17, based on the military doctrine of offensive spirit and direct attacks into German-held Alsace-Lorraine, suddenly found themselves reacting to a German invasion from an unexpected direction. And as French armies attempted to redeploy northward to meet this threat, they suffered catastrophic casualties, in a series of frontier battles, where French soldiers in their distinctive bright blue coats and red trousers, uniforms chosen for morale and tradition, but which made them perfect targets, charged German machine gun positions with fixed bayonets, and were mowed down by the thousands. Learning in the most brutal way possible that 19th-century tactics of élan and offensive spirit meant nothing against 20th-century technology of rapid-fire artillery and belt-fed machine guns. By late August, the situation looked absolutely desperate for France and Britain. The small British expeditionary force that had crossed the Channel to help defend France fought a brave delaying action at the Battle of Mons, but was forced into retreat. French armies were falling back toward Paris in confusion and disarray, and the German right wing was sweeping forward exactly as Schlieffen had envisioned decades earlier, covering up to 25 miles per day in forced marches that left soldiers so exhausted they were literally sleeping while walking, supported by their comrades, feet wrapped in bloody rags because their boots had fallen apart, but still advancing because the plan's timetable was sacred and could not be compromised. In Paris, the French government prepared to evacuate to Bordeaux. Terrified civilians loaded belongings onto carts and fled southward. Military governor began preparing defenses for a siege, and across the English Channel, British newspapers ran increasingly alarmed headlines, speculating that France might collapse entirely within weeks, and Britain would face Germany alone. And for a brief moment in early September 1914, it genuinely seemed like the Schlieffen Plan was going to work, like Schlieffen's ghost would be vindicated, like Germany would actually pull off this impossible gamble and win the war before Christmas. But this is precisely where the plan that had worked so brilliantly on paper and had functioned remarkably well for the first month of actual war began to unravel due to a combination of factors that its creator had never adequately accounted for. And understanding why the Schlieffen Plan failed requires examining three critical, interconnected mistakes that transformed what should have been Germany's greatest victory into the catalyst for 4 years of unimaginable carnage. The first fatal mistake had actually occurred before the war even started. When Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, nephew of the famous Moltke who had won Prussia's wars of unification and now serving as chief of the German General Staff, inherited the Schlieffen Plan and made what seemed like reasonable modifications, but which fundamentally undermined its core logic. Because Schlieffen had designed the plan with mathematical precision, where every division mattered, and the entire concept depended on committing maximum force to the right wing that would sweep through Belgium, creating such overwhelming numerical superiority that French defenders would simply be crushed by the weight of German numbers. But Moltke, worried about defending Alsace-Lorraine and concerned about leaving the German homeland vulnerable, diverted significant forces away from the critical right wing to strengthen other fronts, fundamentally breaking the balance that made the plan work. Schlieffen himself had recognized this danger, allegedly using his dying breath to tell his successors, "Keep the right wing strong," understanding that diluting the offensive power of the Belgian thrust would be catastrophic. But Moltke either didn't understand or didn't believe in the plan's rigid mathematics, and his modifications created a situation where the German forces sweeping through Belgium, while still massive and powerful, no longer had the overwhelming numerical advantage necessary to simply steamroll over French resistance, meaning they had to actually fight for every mile, instead of advancing through sheer unstoppable momentum. And this slowed the advance just enough to matter when every day counted. The second fatal mistake was a problem of logistics that Schlieffen had understood in theory, but that proved far worse in practice. The German army was literally outrunning its own supply lines, because while the soldiers could march 20 or 25 miles per day when pushed to absolute exhaustion, the horse-drawn supply wagons that carried their food, ammunition, and equipment could only make about 12 to 15 miles per day over the same roads that were being torn up by hundreds of thousands of marching feet and thousands of artillery pieces. And this meant that with each day of advance, the gap between the fighting troops and their supplies grew wider and more critical. Horses, which were absolutely essential for moving artillery and supplies in this pre-mechanized era, were dying by the thousands from exhaustion, dehydration, and inadequate feed, literally dropping dead in their harnesses and being pushed off roads so columns could continue moving. And soldiers were marching in boots that were disintegrating, uniforms that were filthy and torn, on minimal food and water, getting perhaps 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night, fighting rearguard actions against French and British forces, and somehow expected to maintain a pace that would get them to Paris on schedule and in condition to fight a decisive battle. German army's own internal reports from late August and early September described soldiers who were falling asleep while marching, and having to be physically supported by their comrades. Men hallucinating from exhaustion and sleep deprivation. Entire units becoming combat ineffective, not from casualties, but from simple physical breakdown. And yet the plan's rigid timetable allowed no time to rest, no opportunity to let supplies catch up, because every day of delay meant the Russians would have more time to mobilize in the east. And this created an impossible situation where the German forces approaching Paris in early September were numerically still formidable, but physically degraded to the point where they were operating at perhaps 50 or 60% effectiveness, just when they needed to be at peak performance. The third and perhaps most catastrophic mistake occurred in mid-August, when Russian forces invaded German East Prussia much faster than German planners had anticipated. Schlieffen's entire concept rested on the assumption that Russia's primitive railroad system and vast distances would require at least 6 weeks for full mobilization, giving Germany time to defeat France first. But instead, Russian armies crossed the border in just 2 weeks, and when news reached Moltke that Russian forces were on German soil threatening East Prussia, he panicked and made a decision that would doom the Western offensive. He diverted 2 entire army corps, over 100,000 of Germany's best troops, away from the crucial right wing just as it approached its moment of decision near Paris, sending them by rail, eastward, to defend against the Russian threat. This decision violated every principle of the Schlieffen Plan, which explicitly accepted that Germany might have to temporarily sacrifice territory in the east in order to win decisively in the west. But Moltke couldn't accept the political and psychological cost of allowing Russian troops to occupy any German territory, and so he weakened the Western offensive at precisely the moment when maintaining maximum pressure was most critical. And in a cruel irony, these troops would arrive in East Prussia too late to participate in the Battle of Tannenberg, where other German forces would win a stunning victory over the Russians anyway, meaning Moltke had weakened his offensive in France for literally nothing. By the first week of September 1914, all of these problems were converging to create a crisis. The German First Army, under General Alexander von Kluck, which was supposed to pass west of Paris in a wide enveloping movement, found itself exhausted, undersupplied, and without sufficient forces to both maintain the planned route and pursue French armies that were retreating before it. And Kluck made a fateful decision to turn his army southeast toward the retreating French forces, rather than continuing west around Paris as the plan specified. And this seemingly tactical choice exposed the entire German right flank to counterattack from the garrison forces defending Paris. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, a methodical man who had maintained remarkable calm throughout the crisis, even as his armies retreated and politicians panicked, immediately recognized this opportunity when aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports revealed the gap opening in the German lines, and he organized every available force he could scrape together: active units, reserve formations, territorial troops, garrison forces, and in one of history's most famous improvisations, even commandeered 600 Parisian taxicabs, to rush 6,000 reserve troops to the front, and on September 6th launched a massive counterattack along the Marne River that caught the Germans by surprise. The Battle of the Marne raged for 4 days across a front of over 200 miles, involving nearly 2 million men in a chaotic struggle where individual units lost contact with their headquarters, where the fighting ranged from modern artillery duels to close-quarters combat with bayonets and rifle butts, where French and British forces pushed into the gap between German armies and threatened to envelop the forces that were supposed to be doing the enveloping. And German commanders on the ground, seeing their exhausted troops unable to maintain the offensive, their flanks increasingly vulnerable, their supplies running critically short, began reporting back to headquarters that the advance had stalled. On September 9th, Moltke, receiving these alarming reports and recognizing that the grand plan had failed to achieve its objective of quickly defeating France, made the agonizing decision to order a general retreat to defensive positions along the Aisne River. And though German forces would remain deep inside France, and the war was far from over, the dream of quick knockout victory that the entire Schlieffen Plan depended on had died, and with it died any chance Germany had of winning a short war. What followed was something that absolutely nobody had planned for, and that military theorists of the era had believed was impossible in modern warfare. Both sides attempted to outflank each other to the north in what became known as the Race to the Sea, each side extending their lines westward, trying to get around the enemy's flank, until by November 1914, an unbroken line of trenches stretched over 400 miles from the Swiss border to the English Channel, and this line would barely move for the next 4 years, despite millions of casualties and countless massive offensives, because the technology of defense, machine guns, quick-firing artillery, barbed wire, and concrete fortifications had completely outpaced the technology of offense, meaning that any attack faced nearly insurmountable obstacles. Soldiers on both sides dug themselves into increasingly elaborate trench systems that became underground cities, complete with command posts, aid stations, supply depots, and living quarters, all connected by communication trenches and protected by sophisticated networks of barbed wire, machine gun positions, and artillery, and what Schlieffen had imagined as a war of rapid movement and decisive victory had transformed into a nightmarish war of attrition, where generals on both sides, still clinging to outdated doctrines of offensive warfare and lacking any other ideas, ordered assault after assault that sent millions of men climbing out of their trenches to advance across open ground swept by machine gun fire and artillery, leading to casualty rates that defied comprehension. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, the bloodiest single day in British military history. And by the time the offensive ended months later, over 1 million men from both sides were dead, wounded, or missing for territorial gains that could be measured in mere miles. And at Verdun, also in 1916, French and German forces engaged in a 10-month battle of mutual destruction that killed or wounded over 700,000 men, fighting over a relatively small salient that had more symbolic than strategic value, with individual positions changing hands dozens of times, and the landscape transformed into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters where literally nothing could survive. The weapons became more horrific as the war progressed. Poison gas was first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, with chlorine gas clouds rolling across no man's land, causing men to drown in their own fluids, leading to an escalating chemical arms race involving phosgene and mustard gas that left hundreds of thousands dead or permanently disabled, flamethrowers that could shoot jets of burning liquid into trenches and bunkers, tanks that first appeared in 1916 as a potential solution to trench warfare, but remained too primitive and unreliable to achieve decisive results. And aircraft that evolved from reconnaissance tools to fighters and bombers engaged in deadly aerial combat and attacks on civilian targets. Home fronts were mobilized to an unprecedented degree, with entire economies transformed to serve the war effort. Factories that had made consumer goods now produced shells and rifles by the millions. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had gone to fight. Governments imposed rationing and censorship and propaganda campaigns, and the distinction between soldier and civilian blurred as both became targets and participants in what became history's first total war. By the time the fighting finally ended on November 11, 1918, after Germany's spring offensives failed and Allied counteroffensives broke German resistance, the world had been fundamentally transformed. Over 17 million people were dead. Another 20 million were wounded. 4 great empires had collapsed. The map of Europe and the Middle East had been completely redrawn, and the psychological trauma of industrial slaughter would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. And the Treaty of Versailles imposed such harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations payments, loss of territory, strict military limits, and a war guilt clause that created resentments festering for decades and providing fertile ground for Adolf Hitler's rise and World War II just 21 years later. So why did they lose when they were supposed to win? The Schlieffen Plan failed because it required perfection in an imperfect world. It demanded perfect timing when logistics made delays inevitable. Perfect execution when human exhaustion made mistakes certain. Perfect adherence to the plan when tactical situations demanded flexibility. And perfect enemy behavior when the French and British proved far more resilient than anticipated. And Schlieffen had created a plan so rigid, so dependent on everything going exactly right, that the moment reality diverged even slightly from his calculations, the entire structure collapsed, proving that even genius-level strategic planning becomes worthless when it can't adapt to the chaos and friction of actual war. And the ultimate irony is that a plan designed specifically to avoid a long two-front war instead created exactly that scenario, trapping Germany in the prolonged conflict that Schlieffen had feared most, and demonstrating that sometimes the most brilliant plan is actually the most dangerous, because it creates false confidence that complex problems can be solved through pure calculation and willpower, leaving us with history's most expensive lesson about the limits of planning, the inevitability of chaos, and the terrible price of strategic rigidity.